All right, we're going to kind of really switch gears today from talking muscle, which we just finished, to now talking about our first structure or part of the cardiovascular system. So we're really switching systems altogether. Okay? Our cardiovascular system is composed of three parts. You have our blood, but you've also then got the heart and your blood vessels, which is where you find your blood. Okay? So even though the blood is not necessarily kind of a major organ, it's a very important component of your cardiovascular system and plays a big role in the function of our body. Okay? So we're going to talk a lot about what it does, obviously, in this lecture. Why it's important is because most of the cells of our body cannot move around in order to obtain the nutrients, oxygen, or to limit their wastes and carbon dioxide that they need. Instead, our blood and interstitial fluid help meet these needs. Blood is defined as a liquid connective tissue composed of a liquid extracellular matrix called blood plasma that will dissolve and suspend various cells and cell fragments. Interstitial fluid, we've learned about since the very first lecture of the semester, is our fluid that bathes our body cells and is constantly renewed by our blood. So it's important that you always remember, and I talk about this since the beginning of the semester, that you have to think of the fluids in our body like a river, and that they're always flowing and exchanging and moving around, and nothing is staying stagnant, or at least should not be staying stagnant. And substances are constantly diffusing from the blood into the interstitial fluid, and from interstitial fluid into the blood. There are three kind of major functions that our blood provides for us. It functions to transport a heck of a lot of things. It protects us, and it regulates certain things as well. Okay. What it transports? Well, I've already mentioned nutrients like oxygen and glucose. Also waste like carbon dioxide and urea, uric acid. Okay. Some of those are carried to our lungs like CO2. Some of those are carried to our kidneys in order to pee them out. The nutrients can either come from the lungs, like oxygen, or the things that we eat and drink, which are picked up in our digestive tract. Okay? We've talked previously about how hormones are carried. Most of our hormones, as we learned, are circulating hormones, produced in one area of the body that need to be circulated with our blood to other areas of the body. Stem cells, another thing that are carried from our bone marrow tissues, and then heat. So I was just talking about this in exercise physiology, is something that our body fluids, specifically our blood, can carry and either help us to dissipate heat or to conserve it. Okay. Our blood provides us with processes that protect us, like inflammation. There's a type of cells in our blood called white blood cells that provide immunity, shouldn't say provided, should just say provide immunity. Antibodies are produced by a certain type of white blood cells that neutralize toxins and pathogens. And then the third type of cell in our blood is called, or are called platelets. They're actually not cells, but cell fragments, but are part of a blood clotting process that helps us stop from bleeding. And then regulation, fluid movement across capillaries helps us stabilize fluid distribution, so it regulates fluid balance and pH balance, as you can see down there, as our blood proteins act as buffers to stabilize pH. All right, this is something that if you've taken anatomy, which I know many of you have, this is going to be a quick review of the composition of blood, what makes it up, what's found in it. So we'll kind of breeze through this pretty quickly. Blood is denser and more viscous or thicker than water, has a slight sticky feel to it. Temperature of our blood is about 38 degrees C. This is going to be at rest, by the way. If you're sitting in a kind of a normal cool environment like this room, that's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 1 to 2, almost 2 degrees higher than oral rectal body temperature. It's going to be more to the skin surface. Slightly alkaline pH, we've learned about that since the beginning of the semester. We like it to be about 7.4, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.35 to 7.45. Color of blood actually varies with its oxygen content. If it's rich in oxygen, it'll be bright red. If it's more poor in oxygen, it'll be dark red. Healthy young female is about 4 to 5 liters, and the male about 5 to 6 liters, which represents about 8% of our total body mass. And making it up are two major parts, our plasma and our formed elements, which you can see the breakdown on those here on the next page. Over half of our blood, so if you were to walk over and, if I were to walk over and poke somebody, spilling out of their body would be over half plasma. Obviously that's dependent upon training state, because, or not training state, but hydration state. Most of that's actually water, but then you've got a lot of other stuff dissolved in it, various plasma proteins, and other solutes like electrolytes, nutrients, gases, etc., etc. Okay. The other 45% are the formed elements, which we have three major types. The most common ones are our red blood cells, which is what RBCs is short for. The fancy way to describe those are erythrocytes. Platelets, which are fancily known as thrombocytes. And then WBCs are white blood cells, which we fancily know as leukocytes. And you can see there are 5 different forms of those: neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils. We'll learn about every single one of those, what they do. And so even though this flowchart's not that really important, it does do a good job of showing the distribution, the amounts, and that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of helpful. Let's first talk about the plasma. We don't spend a whole lot of time talking about plasma in this class, but I do want to mention it a little bit more in greater detail, because there is some important homeostatic function that occurs within our plasma. All right, so what plasma is? Mixture of water, as I just mentioned, primarily water, 91.5%. And then that remains us with about 8.5% that we call solutes. Okay, several of those, but the most common, or the most abundant, are plasma proteins. Okay, they total up to about 6 to 9 grams per deciliter. This G/DL, okay, is short for grams per deciliter. Okay, deciliters are kind of a standard measurement of blood. Instead of pulling out a whole liter of blood, which would be a very significant amount, we pull out a fraction of a liter, which is what a deciliter is. And then we measure out how many plasma proteins we find per deciliter. There's 6 to 9 grams. And most of these are synthesized in our liver by hepatocytes, and we categorize them into 3 types. Albumin is the first type, which serves to transport various plasma solutes and helps maintain osmotic and pH balance of our blood plasma. Okay. Albumins actually are the most numerous. About 54% of our plasma proteins would be albumins. Okay. Globulins are a little bit different. There's actually 3 different classes of those: alphas, betas, and gammas. Of the 3 types listed there, gammas are going to be the most important to us in this class, because when you hear about antibodies, that's what we're talking about here. Okay. The other name for antibodies is actually immunoglobulins, which tells you exactly what they are and what they do. They provide us with immunity, and they are globulin functioning proteins, or globulin class proteins. And, they will interact with foreign substances called antigens, like viruses and bacteria, and when they are exposed to them, will produce millions of different antibodies that are capable of binding specifically to that antigen, stimulated its production in order to disable it. We'll talk about antibodies and their functions in greater detail in our next unit, which will be obviously after spring break. Fibrinogen is our last of the 3 plasma proteins, precursor to fibrin, which we'll talk more about fibrin on Wednesday. It is a sticky protein that forms the framework of a blood clot. And that's what we do when we have damaged blood vessels, and hopefully not in a healthy blood vessel where we see blood clots developing. Okay. Here on our next page is showing you the different substances in our blood plasma. We didn't really get into the other stuff, okay, but there are electrolytes, which remember electrolytes are just ions like sodium and potassium and hydrogen ion. Okay. But then you've also got nutrients, gases like O2, CO2, but even nitrogen. Nitrogen is actually the most abundant gas that we breathe in, so there's going to be nitrogen in your blood. And then various regulatory substances like enzymes, hormones, and vitamins. We've talked about hormones very recently. And then we'll get into more about waste when we get to the urinary system. Over here on the left is showing you what a bag of plasma looks like. You can actually donate plasma and get paid for it. I'm sure there's a place over in St. Joe. I know there's places in Manhattan and Lawrence and in Topeka. They are pretty typically seen in college towns because college kids are a lot of times pretty broke and desperate for money. They need to buy beer or whatever. So you could donate plasma actually a couple of times a week. It's a pretty cool process what they do. They stick a line in your arm just like you're going to donate blood, except they run the blood through a machine that centrifuges out the formed elements, puts those back into your body, and pull out the plasma. Okay? And it's going to look that kind of yellowish, almost kind of looks like real dark yellowish pee, but it's not. It's actually plasma. All right, what we're going to do now is talk about blood cells. So those formed elements. Before we actually get into talking about their functions, I want to talk about their production. Just real briefly, I don't get into it in super great detail. It's actually pretty complicated. So reading through, although some white blood cells have a lifetime measured in years, most of the formed elements of our blood last only hours, days, or weeks, which means that we need to continually replace them. The regulation of red blood cell and platelet production is by negative feedback in order to help maintain steady or hopefully steady numbers. Okay? What we want for red blood cells and platelets is their numbers to stay pretty much the same. White blood cells will vary in number based on what's going on with the body. Okay? When you're sick with like a virus, there's a good chance that some of your white blood cell numbers are going to increase. If you're sick with bacteria or you have a fungal infection, other white blood cells will increase. Because those 5 different white blood cells each have a specific function or functions, and that's why they'll change in number based on the state of the body. And that's why getting a white blood cell count can be a great way of trying to figure out what's wrong with somebody. Okay? So if you ever watch House or any other show like that where they talk about diagnosing certain things, a lot of times you'll hear them say, let's get a white blood count or a differential, because they're trying to figure out what's wrong. And we'll talk about differential white blood counts here, probably not today, but Wednesday for sure, if not today. Anyway, process in which we form the formed elements or make them is called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Both those terms mean the same thing. Okay. And actually has to begin before birth, as we're all aware, probably. Begins very early in development in an embryo in what we call its yolk sac. And in a fetus, as it continues to grow, will then transition over into the liver, spleen, thymus, and lymph nodes. Our red bone marrow becomes the primary site of hemopoiesis just before birth, sometime in kind of the last trimester, and that's going to be the remainder of our life as the source of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Our red bone marrow is highly vascularized and contains pluripotent stem cells, or hemocytoblasts, that have the capacity to develop into many different types of cells, which then reproduce themselves, proliferate, and differentiate into many different cells. Our blood cells, but also other cells like macrophages, reticular cells, mast cells, and adipocytes, and even some form osteoblasts, chondroblasts, and muscle cells. So it's pretty cool that these stem cells form our blood cells, but also very other different cells, because muscle cells, as we're aware, are going to be very different than our blood cells. Now, once blood cells are produced in the marrow, they enter the bloodstream through what we call sinusoids, sort of capillaries that have these large holes that actually allow the blood cells into the circulation. In order to form blood cells, these pluripotent stem cells produce two further types of stem cells, myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. Okay? And that's what we're showing over here on our next page. I'm going to bounce back, so don't leave that page completely. Over here on the left, from our pluripotent stem cell is a myeloid stem cell. Okay? From there, we go through a couple steps. We develop what we call progenitor cells, and then precursor cells, eventually leading to the actual formed elements of the blood. Okay? Once again, there are three different types of formed elements in our blood. Red blood cells, platelets, and then white blood cells. Okay? Well, as you can see, red blood cells come from myeloid stem cells. Platelets also come from myeloid stem cells, as do 4 of our 5 white blood cells. Okay? Eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, and monocytes all were distantly coming from this myeloid stem cell. Lymphoid stem cells actually only end up producing what we call lymphocytes. And there are 3 major types of lymphocytes: B's, T's, and these things that kind of sound like a cool spy, which are called natural killer cells. Okay? So it's easy for lymphocytes that are named lymphocytes, okay, because they begin with the word lymph, as does the word lymphoid. Okay? Natural killer cells don't have lymphocyte in their name at all, but they are a form of lymphocyte. Okay? So the lymphoid stem cells are a little bit more specific in what they make, whereas the myeloid are more differentiated in what they can produce, because they produce just about all of our blood cells, with the exception of those 3 different types of lymphocytes. Okay. During hemopoiesis, some of the myeloid stem cells differentiate into progenitor cells, while others develop into precursor cells. The progenitor cells give rise to more specific elements of the blood, whereas precursor cells, or blasts, as they end in, develop into the actual formed elements. And that's what we're talking about right in here. Okay. Sometimes we go directly from the precursor cell to the formed element. Sometimes there's an extra cell in here. Okay. And we're going to talk specifically about red blood cell production and platelet production as we get into each one of those different types of cells. First, I want to talk about the most common of our formed elements, which are our red blood cells, or fancily known as erythrocytes. 2 principal functions of erythrocytes: pick up oxygen from the lungs, deliver it to our tissues, and the opposite for carbon dioxide: pick it up from the tissues, deliver them to the lungs. They are able to carry oxygen and CO2 because within a red blood cell you find a lot of what we call hemoglobin. Okay. Hemoglobin is actually 33% of the solution of a red blood cell. Okay. And each red blood cell has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules. Each hemoglobin actually can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So each individual red blood cell can carry a very high amount of oxygen. Okay. Now, I've said oxygen, but hemoglobin does carry CO2 as well, carbon dioxide. It just doesn't do it nearly as much as it does for oxygen. Okay. Looking here at the next page, you can see the shape of a red blood cell. Okay, they're very small, and they have kind of that circular structure, and if you cut them open, you'll see they have this indentation. Why they're indented like that is because they don't actually have a nucleus, nor do they have many of the other organelles that you see in other typical cells. Okay, if we go back a couple slides, we can see just before we develop red blood cells, the nucleus is ejected from the cell called a reticulocyte. Okay. This allows for more hemoglobin to be inside of the red blood cell, and therefore helping it better be able to carry oxygen. Now, another important chemical that we've learned a little bit about before is nitric oxide. It's actually produced by endothelial cells that line our blood vessels, can bind to oxygen, or to hemoglobin, Under certain circumstances, hemoglobin will release it, which can cause vasodilation. Okay. Vasodilation means that the blood vessels will increase their lumen and therefore allow more blood flow through. There's a third chemical involved with red blood cells, and that's called carbonic anhydrase, which takes carbon dioxide and water and forms an acid called carbonic acid, which then breaks apart into hydrogen ion and bicarb ions. Why is this important? Because this is going to help regulate our pH. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but not so much today. Looking at the figure here on this next page, letter B shows you what a singular hemoglobin molecule looks like. It's a very complex protein, and it contains not only a protein part, but a non-protein part. Okay. There are 4 protein chains, 2 alphas and 2 betas. Those are the blue shaded kind of squiggly lines in there. Associated with each one of those 4 protein chains is an iron-containing heme. Okay. The protein part is called globin, so there's where the word hemoglobin comes from. Okay. If we zoom in on letter C to show you what a heme looks like, at the dead center of it is a ferrous iron, Fe2+, which is what actually binds with an oxygen molecule. And since there are 4 of those, and each one can carry one singular hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen molecules. 98% or so of our oxygen in our blood is carried by hemoglobin. Okay. Only about 23% of our carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin. So not nearly as high in percentages for carbon dioxide as oxygen. All right, this seems like a good spot to take a break because we'll pick up with the production of red blood cells on Wednesday.